what I see is trust moving from institutions to people. So the type of TV I did was always live breaking news. So that means that sometimes you had 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes if you're lucky, to explain something really complicated, like a policy decision, a court decision. And then you had no time. You had to move on to the next thing. So whether or not you got it right, it didn't matter because it was speed that was of the essence.
Welcome to the Spin Nation podcast. I'm Laura Lostfield,
And I'm Emmanuel Case.
and we are back with our Newsfluencer series. And today we have Karman Wong from the Can't Be Censored podcast. Karman, welcome to the Spin Nation podcast.
Hey guys, so nice to be here.
You came from the mainstream media. So you were on CP24, but you've also been a crisis communications manager, issues manager, public relations, corporate communications. But now you have started your own channel with Travis Danraj, and we would just really want to get into your origin story. So why did you make the decision to move from CP24? It was a big platform to starting your own channel.
Thank you first for having me. And when I left politics to go into journalism, it was mostly broadcast journalism, so TV. And at some point in time, it stopped being fun, stopped feeling like journalism, and it didn't feel good anymore. So I left. Um, I
Wait,
started.
you move on, I want to just pull on something you just said. It stopped being journalism or stopped
Yeah.
feeling like journalism. Can you break that down for us?
So the type of TV I did was always live breaking news. So that means that sometimes you had 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes if you're lucky, to explain something really complicated, like a policy decision, a court decision. And then you had no time. You had to move on to the next thing. So whether or not you got it right, it didn't matter because it was speed that was of the essence. And also, back when I started in journalism, there were a lot more resources, right? And towards the end of when I was leaving, resources were pretty slim, not as slim as they are now, but it was starting to move in the direction where it was just all cuts, bare minimum. And, just to get a product onto the air was very difficult and it took a lot of shortcuts. I think what's missing from traditional media is a few things. I think it's time and it's trust. So I think, and you guys will know this because you do the research, but for me, anecdotally, what I see is trust moving from institutions to people. So you're calling me a newsfluencer. This is the name of this.
Newsfluencer, yeah.
It's a new type of person that people are listening to. Like I would never say I'm a journalist right now. What I do is not journalism. There is a place for people who do that sort of work. It's not me and it's not Travis and it's not Can't Be Censored. We make it clear that we are not objective. We have opinions. And if you want to see like objective on the ground first source reporting, that's not us. But people do place their trust that we're putting something on our platform that, typically we haven't edited that much. We're going to ask questions that we're interested in, but maybe you're interested in too. And so people turn to us for different things, right? So I think mainstream media is losing a bit of trust. I think time is something that we have a lot of on podcasts to look at issues more in depth, to look at more context, to look at more nuance. And in broadcast media, especially, you got to move on to the next thing and it's pretty quick. So I think that's sort of what's missing in traditional media and why people have moved over to different platforms.
Here on the Spin Nation podcast of our pet theories is that one of the big differences between incumbent media is that the way they produce the news has become very clinical. It's hard for the common listener to understand what does this mean for my life. And our feeling is that the emerging newsfluencers are there talking in a, like you say, in a much more long form format and helping put in perspective some of the events happening around the world into words that are understandable and make sense to a regular audience listener.
And you'll see that traditional media is trying to replicate what podcasts and those newsfluencers are doing. Like you see big networks like CNN, CBS trying to replicate the feeling of what podcasts do. So, the idea of Jake Tapper with all his pictures behind him, his personal office, or Anderson Cooper at a desk with two podcast microphones. Like these are really talented media personalities who definitely could do podcasting. But, I think with traditional media, it's hard for people to accept that shift because they are an institution. People go to them for certain things and to have certain biases, whatever it is. And so it's tough for them to regain that sort of ground and regain that trust and authenticity. And I think again, like people who've left mainstream media, like the Jim Acostas or we interviewed Chuck Todd, who used to be a political correspondent at CNN. Those people left, they've developed their own platform and people follow them because they trust them, not because they trust CNN, because they trust them. So I think that's where the shift is going. I think there definitely still is a role for mainstream media. There's a role for journalism, no question. Do not want to see that disappear. We rely on people who have the resources to put cameras on the ground, to be firsthand account takers of history, to tell us what's happening on the ground. I can't do that. People who sit in their office can't do that. And so we have to rely on certain institutions to tell us those things. But then to interpret what those events are, I think is moving away from news to different platforms.
I think for a Carney, where you have to have your official announcement as the prime minister, you need the traditional media to cover the event to say, Carney said XYZ, because your newsfluencers or your podcasters or YouTubers aren't going to be flying to Halifax and to Ottawa and to wherever he is going to be, Vancouver, to do a press conference, right? So the media have that access. But then the personalities that we're talking about, the newsfluencers, they can then take the mainstream media and then they interpret for the regular Canadian. Where I think that our politicians, and I think Poilievre is more caught onto this than Carney's team, but if they are not working with those who are interpreting what the news means for Canadians, they leave that completely up to those who want to interpret it any way they want. They're not helping to shape or help them to understand or reinforce, well, what does this mean? How does this matter? And I think that's a big miss.
And I would say it's not even just, people like us who produce content, but the politicians themselves are becoming content creators. Right? So they're not putting out that 3-page policy paper, press release, and that's the only way they're communicating. They have their own YouTube followings, right? They have their own channels. They have their own Instagrams. And that's how they're getting their own message across. In addition to bringing along some of these other content creators.
True. True. But I will say though, as you I think very correctly pointed out, people don't trust. Like they don't trust Carney. They're gonna trust, Moose on the Loose, or they're gonna trust Jasmine Lane. So not that I expect Mark Carney to go on Jasmine Lane anytime soon, but if they're only relying on their own channels, their ability to reach beyond those who are already bought in is very limited. I just think that they're being overly cautious and not really embracing the new way that information and perception and understanding is developed in Canada. I think particularly the Carney government has been really slow. I mean, even provincially, like a lot of the provincial governments are not very good at it. I'm talking to you about it because you also were a political operative and communicator. So you have inside experience and knowledge about how these things get developed. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think in any sort of political calculus, it's risk reward, right? So it's like, for example, like we've been trying to get Doug Ford to come on for a very long time to the podcast since day one. And, we've had his family members on, but we haven't had him on. And I actually think, Doug Ford, if you've ever seen him talk at length, like maybe he's done like a fireside chat or even during his like media availabilities or scrums, like he is the best. People like him the most when he is off the cuff, when he's just his folksy self. And I think he really thrives in an environment where he can talk like that. But the risk for them as, if someone is working for the Premier of Ontario, is that if you get someone talking for too long, they talk too much, they say too much, they don't stick to message discipline, they go off course. So that is the risk, right? So for them, they have to figure out, well, what is better? Is a reward that we're going to get better? Are we going to reach the people we want to reach? Is this going to show a great side of him? Or are we going to say something that's going to, mess up the news cycle for a couple of days? So, I mean, I get it. I get why people do that. I just think, if you are avoiding talking on these long form platforms, you are missing out on reaching a big, big part of the audience that you could be talking to.
100%.
47% of Canadians get their news from social and other channels, and that's goes as high as like 65 or 70% for the younger cohorts.
But Emmanuel,
So yeah,
aren't like mainstream media, aren't they also part of that equation? Like when you're looking at, social media, like they're on social media too. So people could be watching what they're doing.
absolutely. Traditional media's got a good chunk of the YouTube views for Canadians, probably 10 times as big as the independent voices. But the question becomes, who is the actual agenda center? To your
Hmm.
point around the incumbent news, they report on the news, the facts, but then somebody comes in and either provides additional context for that. So I think that's the voice. That's where the emerging independents are driving the agenda in many cases.
Travis, obviously, he left CBC with quite the bang.
Yeah.
And you guys, pretty quickly after he left, turned on Can't Be Censored. But was that already in the works, or was that a last minute decision that as he left CBC and threw a bit of a grenade on his way out the door, you were said, let's just try this?
Yeah, I'd been thinking about doing a podcast for many, many, many years. So for about 2 or 3 years, I was always on the road. And after a while, you've listened to all the music you can listen to. And so I turned to podcasts and I thought, okay, this is where you can go to hear things you want to hear about. And it's interesting conversations that really get you invested. And I thought it was a very interesting platform. Not unsimilar to talk radio, by the way, which I also dabbled in after television. So I, I was thinking about doing it. Travis and I have worked together for many, many years. We're also friends. And we often have these really heated discussions, and we kind of fall on different sides of the political spectrum. And we thought, okay, if we could just capture some of that on a podcast, at least our friends might like it. We'll like it. We think it's interesting. Maybe other people think it's interesting too. And so the timing kind of just worked out, right? It kind of coincided with the time that he was ready to leave the CBC. And like the idea of can't be censored is an idea that people who don't normally get the airtime on mainstream media, topics that don't get the time to breathe and to talk, that's what we kind of want to do on our platform. Um,
Right away, your podcast became on our list as one of the podcasts or in our YouTube channels to watch in Canada for political and current affairs conversations. So you did develop a big following right away. I would say part of that is as a result of Travis and the way that he left the CBC and that whole breakup story. But do you think that that origin story and the relation to the CBC that ended up shaping the direction of Can't Be Censored?
Yeah, look, there's a lot of interest in Travis's story because of this idea that um, we have this big public broadcaster that we put taxpayer dollars in, and that it had become more concerned with other things rather than serving the public in a way that it was supposed to. The same for me, leaving traditional media and journalism was a recognition that over time, the framework that we were telling these stories in really wasn't working anymore. So both of us kind of, mine was gradual, it's not dramatic, but the same sort of realization. And I think that's a sentiment that most people are feeling as well. So we kind of rode the public sentiment of, you know, of this distrust or critical questioning of institutions like the CBC, and we developed our show. We have gone towards topics that fit within our narrative of people who can't be censored, right? People who may not fit in the mainstream media, may not get the same sort of attention, may not get the same sort of space. I think that's basically what we've tried to do. Listen, we tried to put on a variety of guests, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. While we want to diversify and we want to do things a little bit differently, sometimes the audience doesn't follow you that way quite yet. So, I mean, we're pretty new. We're less than a year old. I think we're 6 months old, but I think we're still a little bit early in terms of developing our identity and people getting used to who we are and getting to know us.
And, part of your challenge is, of course, trying to figure out the algorithm, because the algorithm rewards a specific audience that you've established at the
Conflict.
beginning and
Yeah.
probably reinforces that.
Yeah. I don't know if I try to understand the algorithm anymore, but if you are doing this to make a living, like if you're doing it to monetize your podcast or like make money being like a content creator, you have to care about the algorithm, right? Because that's how you get clicks, that's how people watch, that's how you get advertisers, whatever. And even though we try to just have that common thread of like, if you're someone who we're interested in, you got interesting things to say, and you kind of more or less, fall within can't be censored sort of category, we want to have you on. We interviewed someone, she's this amazing astrophysicist, and she talks about life on other planets and space travel. And I thought that was so interesting, but it's not going to help our algorithm. People are not clicking on that because that's not what they're tuning into us for. They're tuning into us for like Pierre Polyev. That was our best episode that we've had so far when we interviewed Pierre Polyev. Polyev. Um,
Pierre
I
Poilievre and Mark Carney overperform by 300%
do they?
and pretty much
Then
across
have
the
me on
board.
again then.
Now you need to get Carney on.
We've asked him several times. I don't know why he
Yeah.
wouldn't do it, but we'll see. Yeah. Like,
All right. Well, this has been a really interesting discussion. I've wanted to have you on our show since you launched your show. If you haven't checked out Can't Be Censored, the podcast, do check it out. They have very interesting guests on. Thank you so much for coming on our Newsfluencers series, Karman. We really appreciate it. And we hope to see you in our top 10 or top 20 list of podcasts in Canada in the future.
thanks for having me, guys. It's fun.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.